immemorial, humanity has pursued answers to the fundamental in this life and the next.
The Lord opened my eyes. I have seen things which lie deeply concealed in man. I am well aware that many will say that no one can talk with spirits and angels as long as he lives in the body, that it is a fantasy. But by all this I am not deterred, for I have seen, I have heard, and I have felt.
Emmanuel Swedенborg was born in Stockholm in 1688, a time when the challenge that science posed to religion was one of the most important topics of the day. The dawning of the 18th century brought sweeping changes throughout Europe. Democracy, industrialization, and invention spread across the continent. The Age of Reason ushered in a compelling new belief in science, providing a new lens with which to view the world. Scientists were energized with a vision of endless possibility. They believed if they adhered strictly to the scientific method, objective observation and testing, first formulated by Francis Bacon in the 16th century, they could dispel the clouds of religious superstition and begin to truly understand the world. Swedенborg was born into a world ripe for a new type of spiritual exploration.
Swedенborg grew up in a very religious household. So the atmosphere in the household was one of both faith or belief and charity. Pietism emphasized the fact that you've got to live your religion, and a very strong belief in the existence of the spiritual world and of spirits and angels.
Swedенborg's first contacts with the spiritual world were with invisible spiritual playmates.
Swedенborg's parents report that when he was small, he would have playmates in the garden, and he would come in and report these remarkable interchanges with them, and they said that at times the most amazing things would come out of his mouth.
After graduation, the promising young Swede traveled for the next 5 years to meet and study with some of Europe's greatest minds. When he returned home, he poured himself into inventing and writing, founding Sweden's first scientific journal. His mind brimming with ideas and his notebook full of inventions, he worked for the next few years as an assistant to Christopher Polhem, Sweden's most famous inventor. They collaborated on several major projects, including the Trollhättan Canal, a particularly challenging engineering problem due to a series of steep ascents over rugged mountains. Swedenborg focused his efforts on developing methods that enabled people to do things more efficiently. He designed an extraordinary range of inventions: a steel rolling mill, a crane to hoist cannons, a hearing aid, a rapid-firing air gun, an air pump, and the world's largest dry dock, to name just a few. In addition, Swedenborg invented an airplane some 200 years before the Wright brothers, and it was the first known vehicle to incorporate aerodynamic principles for flight. In the late 19th century, a working version of his glider plane was built and flown, and a model now resides in the Smithsonian Institute in Washington, D.C. Curator Dr. Paul Garber explains some of the plane's ingenious features.
This is a scale model of the aircraft of Emmanuel Swedенborg, which he conceived back in 1714, many, many years before the modern airplane, and yet he incorporates in this some of the essentials of modern aircraft. These are louvered so that the air on the downstroke, the power stroke, will give the lift. And then on the return stroke, these louvers will open up so as to let the air pass through. Then he has a very interesting undercarriage here, and that has these four struts, and they constitute the landing gear for takeoff and landing. He has wheels on that. And then he realized the need for stability. He incorporated that in this pendulum. And this, of course, sought a center because of its weight and force of gravity. Think of this as the mind of a real genius of that early time.
In 1719, when he was 31, Swedenborg was appointed Royal Assessor of Mines, a position he held for much of his life. This motivated him to design many of his devices to improve safety and efficiency in the mining industry.
In order to really appreciate the significance of Swedenborg's inventions, you need to realize that copper mining was the industry in Sweden. There was a copper mine called the Giant Copper Mountain up in Falun, which produced a tremendous amount of copper. And one of the main challenges was, how are we going to get all this wood down into the mine for burning in order to break off the copper, and how are we going to haul all of this copper out fast enough? So many of his inventions have buckets and pulleys and are for hauling logs. Swedenborg at one point was asked by Charles XII to solve a great military problem, which was how to get all of his ships 5 miles over land on very steep mountainous terrain. And Swedenborg was just a young engineer at the time, but he tackled the problem and solved it. He used some rolling logs and some pulleys and some engineering miracle to get all these ships across land. The enemy didn't expect at all for ships to be coming over the mountains, and so they were trounced by the Swedish troops.
Swedenborg seems to have mastered every field of knowledge he explored. He helped establish the disciplines of metallurgy and crystallography, produced the first Swedish algebra and calculus texts, and wrote scientific works in almost every subject from astronomy to zoology.
He became, over the course of time, so famous as a scientist in Europe that his movements were recorded in the papers. Swedenborg today left Amsterdam, as if that fact in and of itself was a worthwhile thing for people to know. He became quite famous, particularly for his magnum opus. The Principia was published in 3 volumes. The first volume was philosophy. In the second and third volumes, he wrote about iron and copper, which were the economic backbone of the Swedish economy.
Swedenborg's burning scientific thirst also drew him to study atomic theory and cosmology. He anticipated many concepts which scientists only confirmed recently, such as the molecular basis of magnetism. But Swedenborg came to realize that science wasn't an end in itself. He said, "I was introduced to the natural sciences and studied them for 30 years.
Thus I was prepared to understand the things which lie deeply concealed. Field.
Many people have been intrigued with Swedenborg's intelligence. He was among the people who were studied by a group at Stanford University working with Professor Terman to see who had been the most brilliant people in the world. 3 people tied for first place: Swedenborg, Goethe, and John Stuart Mill.
The single purpose of my studying anatomy was to search for the seat of the soul in the body, for the soul is represented in the body, which is its mirror.
Swedenborg poured all his energy into his work.
Then he set about in a systematic way to interpret the symbols that he found in the dreams, years, of course, before Freud and Jung ever attempted the same thing.
Eventually, Swedenborg developed his own path to heightened consciousness. As a scientist, he had become capable of a concentration so intense that his breathing virtually stopped. An experience familiar to saints and mystics of both East and West. Now far into the spiritual dimensions. In exploring the domain of angels and spirits in the spiritual world, Swedenborg observed that they are reflections both of our own subconscious and of a larger transpersonal world. Egyptian hieroglyphics, mythology, alchemy, and other symbolic systems of antiquity. In correspondence, the images or symbols are not to be idolized, but rather to remind people of, or awaken them to, the heavenly things which they signify. Swedenborg believed that the divine is present in all living things, and that in the system of correspondence he had discovered the underlying principles of the larger pattern. Found the application of correspondence fruitful in another realm, his beloved Bible, which for him was an eloquent testimony to the presence of the divine. In many passages, he discovered the symbolic imagery of correspondences. For example, the opening passages of the book of Genesis. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth, can be translated, in the beginning, God created within each of us spiritual realities symbolized by heaven and material needs symbolized by earth. Life is an interplay of spirit and matter. As we evolve, we learn to strike a balance within ourselves, integrating heavenly and earthly The Bible reveals unexpected depths. Within its text, Swedenborg found three levels of meaning.
He says that the first and perhaps the simplest one is that the Bible narrative from Genesis through to the end of Revelation is really a spiritual history of the whole human race. He calls this the internal historical sense of the Bible. The second level really gives detailed information about everything that can happen to an individual human being in terms of their spiritual growth and development. The process that God went through in taking on this human, and we have the unique phrase, the divine human.
For Swedenborg, the principles of correspondence were not merely intellectual theories. They were an integral facet of his intimate experience of the spiritual world.
After his spiritual eyes were open, Swedenborg spent much of his writing explaining Scripture and also documenting his spiritual experiences. Early on, you see both of these types of material side by side. He's moving along, explaining some verse in the Old Testament, and then he will suddenly shift, sometimes in mid-sentence, into a spiritual experience, and to indicate that, he indents the text on the manuscript page. So, for example, sometimes he explains that he'll be writing about Moses, and then he'll suddenly say, I am with Moses right now, and he's saying this, and he's saying that. Or he reports exchanges with Solomon or with other people who are in the spiritual world.
We are because God is. All things are full of God, and all take their portion from that fullness.
After his spiritual awakening, Swedenborg found a means to begin integrating science and spirit through careful observation and consistent recording of his explorations in the spiritual dimensions. He also knew he needed to address humanity's growing spiritual skepticism, which was being fueled by the new faith in science. So for the next 30 years, he painstakingly documented his otherworldly journeys, and what he found proved extraordinary.
Swedenborg reports having experienced firsthand what it's like to die, much the way people go through near-death experiences, only his was kind of deliberate in order to show him what the experience of dying is like, which we all wonder about.
What he says to us is really reassuring, because he says there is no pain. There's no such thing as a painful death, and really there's no such thing as a sudden death. Not only is there's no physical pain, there's not even mental anxiety. You can sometimes say of a person that their death was a nice, peaceful transition in sleep, and you might contrast that with someone who died in a car accident or in an explosion or in the violence of war. But really, all deaths are gentle transitions. The initiation of the process may be one thing, but the death itself is very gentle and is overseen and protected by angels whose very occupation it is to preside over people who are dying.
Swedenborg describes the continuation of our afterlife journey, which follows the death of the physical body.
He says that, first of all, you wake up in a beautiful world that's very much like the one you're in now. You see people who have gone on before you. Within a short while, you are in a state very much like you were in this world, and you start to alternate between that state and what he calls your inner state, a state of who you really are at your core. You go through a process of being boiled down to what that core is, with things that don't belong in that core or don't accord with it being removed over time, so that people get down to an essence that's either good or it's evil, and they find their home in either heaven or hell. There are many, many heavens arranged according to the specifics of what people love and what they believe, and many, many hells according to the particular kind of evil that they're addicted to.
Swedenborg said that as we progress toward the inner state, some ugly emotions can erupt, but to reach heaven, we need to be willing to face our hidden dark side, our selfish and destructive impulses.
If we defend and gravitate toward them, then we move closer and closer toward hell. If we see them and say, no, I don't want to be that kind of person, we move closer and closer toward heaven. Then he says that for people who ultimately choose hell, fine, that's where they go, that's where they want to be. For people who choose heaven, there's a third state, which is one of instruction, because there is so much to learn, and because a heavenly attitude toward life is an attitude that is open to learning and hungry for learning. It wants to know, wants to understand.
Swedenborg's meticulous note-taking produced one of the most extensive documentations of the death experience ever recorded, and yet for 2 centuries, his account remained largely unconfirmed.
We're heading into VFib. I want 200 watt seconds on that defibrillator, and I want it now. Let's go. Please. Hurry up, we're losing her.
Today, with modern medicine's resuscitation techniques, millions of people have reported having near-death experiences.
I could see the doctors trying to revive me. I found myself carried through a long tunnel toward a radiant light. I have never felt so completely known, so completely loved.
For the majority, the effect on their lives has been positive.
We have a pulse.
These contemporary accounts lend substance to Swedenborg's findings, since people return from near-death experiences with new values and a radically different view of themselves. In addition to these striking similarities between contemporary accounts of near-death experiences and Swedenborg's own account, his reports of 27 years include a wealth of fascinating detail on a wide range of spiritual topics.
Swedenborg teaches that the human mind is actually in the human form, and that we already have a spirit that's alive in the spiritual world, even though most of the time we don't sense that world. When we arrive in the other world, angels look at that spiritual body, which is in the complete human form, and amazing to say, they can read all the events of our lives written on there. So the traumas that we've been through, the good decisions that we made, the bad decisions, are all written on our bodies, almost as if we were a videotape and they simply play the tape and can see in a moment the events of our lives and, most importantly, what we love and who we are. This is the book of life that's been much talked about, that you have a complete internal memory that stores everything that's happened to you, everything you said and thought and read. All the events of your life are stored in a most perfect way in your spiritual book of life.
Swedenborg reported learning that after death, the soul moves through a progression of states. The goal of this process is heaven, but it is a heaven that is quite different from what most organized religions have led us to expect. Swedenborg describes a heaven that is lively, many-leveled, and multifaceted.
Swedenborg experienced 3 levels of heaven, one that he called roughly a natural, or I prefer behavioral heaven, for people who basically don't want to probe too deeply into the nature of things. They want to be decent, caring people and lead a good, honest life. And that's all that matters to them. He saw a higher level of heaven for people who wanted really to understand themselves and other people, whose focus was on that understanding. And he saw a highest level of heaven for people who were totally, utterly, transparently loving, and who simply felt the reality, didn't have to analyze it, didn't have to probe.
The concept of heaven that we get from Swedenborg is really radical compared to many other views. He not only says that people from all phases and types of life on this earth are there, but he was completely convinced that there were many, many other inhabited planets in the universe, and that all of these people had a heaven.
At the heart of Swedenborg's description of heavenly community is an intriguing view of the way they are formed.
Communities in the other world are very much different from the communities here. Here, everybody mixes and mingles together, but in the other world, it's the like-minded who band together, and the focus of the community is some particular useful service, much like the human body, where you have a purpose outside of self that community serves, and you find yourself so at home with the other people who have the same mission that you have.
Swedenborg reports
In the book, Richard Matheson credits Swedenborg with giving him idea on the other life, and one of the striking things is his use of color. Swedenborg's emphasis on color in the other life.
The Church of the Lord is universal.
As extraordinary as are Swedenborg's heavenly descriptions are his accounts of hell. There are no traditional fiery pits for punishing souls. Rather, as in parts of heaven, the locales appear somewhat earth-like, but here they mirror each inhabitant's own darker inner nature. Swedenborg's hell is not a place where someone else punishes us for the evils we have committed on earth, but a place where we experience the inevitable effects of our own relentless selfishness. Swedenborg also reports that it is not a place where the soul is cast by outside forces, but that the beings there feel irresistibly drawn to be there.
Swedenborg's hell is a remarkable place. For one thing, he says that who you are inside is reflected outside of you in the vegetation and the structures and buildings that are around you. Hell is largely devoid of vegetation, or at best it has brambles and thorns, a lot of rocky and sandy places and swamps where the frogs croak and the crocodiles crawl. People find their place there according to the particular evil that they love the most, and this evil is represented around them by a kind of filth, or what angels would perceive as filth, but which the inhabitants find most delightful, actually. Hell is arranged very carefully according to the different kinds of loves, and there's a lot of restrictions on what you can do and can't do. You are not allowed to hurt other people or to hurt the angels or infest people who are in this world.
As a result of his remarkable spiritual quest, Swedenborg gained profound insight into the meaning and purpose of existence.
Swedenborg saw the whole universe as created for the purpose of soul-making. Soul-making not just for individuals, incidentally, but for community as well.
Since we are implanted in the divine, we can never die, for we are in what is eternal and infinite. So far as you approach and draw near to God, doing so entirely as if of your own accord, so far does God approach and draw near to you, and becomes one with you in your inmost being.
One of Swedenborg's spiritual insights concerns the nature of angels. He saw their powerful, loving energy radiating as colorful emanations, perhaps the reason they are often pictured with wings. In fact, he says that God intends each one of us to one day become an angel.
Swedenborg's remarkable claim is that over a 27-year period, he had daily interaction with angels. He became very familiar with them and would talk with the same people sometimes for years on end. He says that their language is a beautiful language, a language of love. He has great difficulty expressing exactly how they communicate because they use visual symbols, hand gestures, facial expressions, and can convey in a single word what would take a half an hour in earthly language to express inadequately. He says that angels are also able to tell from a single word that someone else speaks what their whole state is and what their nature is. So angelic language is extremely efficient. He reports seeing someone who had recently died in the other world who had encountered his little brother who had died as a child and become an angel. And the brother spoke to him with such love that this person who was a hardened businessman melted into tears and dissolved because he said it was as if love itself was speaking.
Swedenborg talks about an angelic language, which he says all of us know deep down inside of us. It talks about the vowels as being inherently expressive of our feelings and the consonants inherently making the distinctions that our thought makes. So that in an instant, he says, an angel can say more than we can say in an hour, which is a marvelously expressive language. And he says that the earliest languages were like this, so that in a sense he picks Hebrew, that was the oldest language he knew, as having some resemblance to this angelic language. But presumably the earlier you could go, if you could go, into the history of language, the more you'd find this responsiveness between the contents of the soul and the forms of expression.
While looking at angels, Swedenborg often witnessed an extraordinary relationship in the afterlife between two individuals who had been loving couples before death.
Swedenborg has wonderful descriptions of his encounters with angels in the spirit world. And you have to realize that he's moving in a kind of a shape-shifting dimension in which appearance and metaphor ceaselessly interpenetrates the perceptual field. Nonetheless, on closer inspection of what seems to be a single being, an angel, he actually discerned that there were two beings, two appearing within the overall angel, and that this was a man and a woman in relationship in a kind of a dynamic divine dance of rapture.
His position is that because God is love, then human love is in a continuation with divine love.
A man and a woman who are truly in love use each other as both the actual recipient and the symbol for something which otherwise would be described as belonging to the divine or divine love. And so in this earthly covenant that we call marriage, there is the creation of a spiritual being. And this is how, Swedenborg says, an angel is created.
We cannot become angels, that is, come into heaven, unless we bring something of an angelic character from living in the world. Heaven consists of a heartfelt desire for the good of others rather than our own good, not for the sake of any selfish hope of reward.
Swedenborg's experiences in the spiritual realms offered him the rare opportunity to bring back a dynamic and practical philosophy, one that could help others find a greater fulfillment and meaning in their lives. He advised that the effort to become a better person, by seeing and then rooting out our flaws, should be made without harsh self-judgment, and that when we're faced with difficulties, we should remain positive and find strength through prayer. Even wrongdoing and evil, he said, can be useful, since we may learn from them what not to choose, and there is no freedom if we have no choice. He emphasizes that it's up to each of us to freely choose to do good, and to do so in a loving and thoughtful manner. As incredible as it seems, Swedenborg reported that our behavior may sometimes be affected by external good or evil forces flowing in from the other world, and he offers a practical perspective to help us maintain our power of choice.
One of the most amazing things that Swedenborg says is this business of everything flowing in from the other world. And you can make all of that objective to yourself and simply say, all I am is a choice. I sit here in the middle, and I choose to have love in myself, and I choose not to have hatred or cruelty or revenge in myself.
We can become one with God only through love and loving actions, love being the essence of spiritual connection. Everything we confirm by our will and understanding remains to eternity. Everything in heaven, in the world, and in the human body, both great and small, was created from use, in use, and for use.
Swedenborg's philosophy of love in action has been called a theology of uses, and it has become a potent method for personal growth and spiritual development.
One of his greatest themes and legacies is the idea of usefulness. The idea that to be spiritual, you need to be active in this world.
Swedenborg emphasizes love. Love for God and love for our neighbors. Love is to be a tangible thing, expressed through uses, through usefulness, which means doing things for other people, using our own talents on their behalf. The point of usefulness is the love which you're putting into action. You don't have to be perfect, but caring makes a big difference in the whole nature of what we do.
Swedenborg would say that one of our hells is exclusive self-preoccupation. Well, the question then arises, what is the opposite of that? Why being concerned for your fellow human beings? And in this regard comes Swedenborg's idea of uses, namely that we are probably at our healthiest, both mentally and emotionally, when we are serving others. There's a Japanese style of therapy based on this called Naikan therapy, in which people who have an overwhelming amount of depression or anxiety or neurotic self-absorption are cured by having them help others in acts of charity.
The impact of uses on a person's life is seen only by living it. If we have as a goal or purpose in our life to be of use to other people in any number of ways that are available to us, it does something to us. It makes a psychological change in us that opens up new vistas for us that we had never been aware of before. And it does mean that we do become literally a different person by practicing this over a long period of time.
Love is the life of humanity. Freedom and love are one. To act from the enjoyment of one's love is to act in freedom.
Swedenborg's philosophy of uses found expression in the 19th century American folk hero John Chapman, known as Johnny Appleseed. While many Americans know of his work planting apple orchards, few are aware that he also planted spiritual seeds, handing out pages from Swedenborg's books. Acting as a one-man wilderness lending library, he brought light to the struggling pioneer families, calling Swedenborg's teachings good news fresh from heaven. Helen Keller, blind, deaf, and mute, was another remarkable person deeply influenced by Swedenborg's teachings. When she was barely a teenager, she began asking spiritual questions and failed to get answers that satisfied her. Then one day, she was introduced to Swedenborg's books by John Hitz, an associate of her close acquaintance, inventor Alexander Graham Bell.
When John Hitz came to visit her when she was about 12 and discovered she had these questions, he presented her with a volume of Swedenborg's Heaven and Hell in Braille. That was just the first of many Swedenborg volumes which she read throughout her life.
Helen Keller grew up to be an inspiration for generations of people. In her spiritual autobiography, Light in My Darkness, she writes of Swedenborg, "His truths have been to my faculties what light, color, and music are to the eye and ear. They have given me a vivid consciousness of the complete being within me. One thing I know, that whereas I was blind, now I can see." She said that Swedenborg's teachings enabled her to understand and value herself as a spiritual being, regardless of her limitations. The result was her extraordinary determination to become a useful person, which empowered her to devote her life to studying, writing, and traveling to educate others about the gifts and special needs of people like herself. Her efforts altered forever the perception and treatment of people with disabilities the world over.
To think and to will without action, when one is able, is like a flame shut up in a vessel, which dies away.
After Swedenborg's spiritual revelations, he underwent numerous changes. His extraordinary experiences, far from fostering an otherworldly attitude, instead strengthened his resolve to live a philosophy of uses. He worked to express his spiritual insights to others through his writing. His output grew into an immense and remarkable body of theological work, including such titles as Heaven and Hell, Divine Love and Wisdom, Divine Providence, and the multi-volume Arcana Celestia, or Secrets of Heaven. When Queen Ulrike granted nobility to his family, Emmanuel was given the opportunity to serve in politics, and he became an involved member of the House of Nobles.
Swedenborg, after his spiritual awakening, softened. You can see an increased humility and a reduction in that arrogant, youthful pride that he used to have. He also became more aware of the primacy of love, the fact that love and feeling was even more important than the world of thought in which he had excelled. He also purchased a large, beautiful property on an island in the south overlooking Stockholm. And I see this as significant that after his spiritual eyes were opened, that he became more a citizen of this world, more involved in politics, and more involved in home ownership and entertaining people than he ever had been before in his life.
Change also swept through Swedenborg's social and personal life. While he was disappointed in love as a young man, and so chose to remain a lifelong bachelor, after his spiritual opening, he met a woman named Countess Gyllenborg. Legend has it that he confided to friends that he had finally found his true love, and even expected her to be his mate in heaven after death. Another personal change was the striking increase in his psychic perception.
After Swedenborg's spiritual awakening, apparently spiritual powers developed alongside his connection with the other world. He published his works for a long time anonymously. For about 15 years after his spiritual eyes were opened, he was publishing without putting his name on the title page. So no one knew who was the origin of these works that were full of these spiritual experiences.
But all that changed when his psychic gifts became public. Mrs. William Castell witnessed one of the best documented cases of Swedenborg's clairvoyance. It occurred at her home in Gothenburg, Sweden, in 1759, at a dinner party attended by Swedenborg and 15 other guests.
I noticed he pushed his plate aside and became much more agitated, and I inquired again if there was anything I could do. Well, he stood up and soon began talking and telling us about a fire in Stockholm.
Stockholm? But Stockholm is some 300 miles distant from your home in Gothenburg.
Yes, but he described in every detail how the fire began, the buildings it was consuming, how it was finally extinguished just 2 doors from his house. This was on Thursday. Saturday, a messenger came from Stockholm, and we learned that every detail Swedenborg had told us was true. Well, people of all sorts then became curious.
After this event, the Queen of Sweden, among others, sought out Swedenborg for his extraordinary psychic gift.
So many people became interested in Swedenborg's spiritual connection at that point. And somehow this led to an awareness of his having published these books as well. So he became famous again. After 15 years of being in the shadow with his spiritual powers, it came to light. And for the rest of his life, he was famous a second time, not this time as a scientist, but as a revelator, as someone with a spiritual connection.
At age 84, Swedenborg's long and extraordinary life came to a peaceful close. Remarkably, he died precisely as he had predicted, which was attested to by his maid, Elizabeth Reynolds, at 5 p.m. on March 29, 1772.
When our bodies cease to function, we do not die, but pass from a dim life to a clear one, for the death of the body is only the continuation, and also the perfection of life.
Swedenborg's ideas on the nature of spiritual reality have influenced many remarkable people the world over. Writers and artists have often been catalysts of profound changes in society, so it is not surprising that Swedenborg's insights were first embraced and then expressed in myriad ways by such outstanding European writers as Goethe, Balzac, Elizabeth and Robert Browning, Baudelaire, Coleridge, Yeats, and Dostoevsky. Their works in turn transmitted his insights to society at large. Some of the effects were subtle, some quite bold. In Emmanuel Swedenborg, A Continuing Vision, editor Robin Larson explores Swedenborg's sweeping influence on Western culture.
The influence of Swedenborg on European art and literature probably begins most importantly with Goethe. We know that Goethe read Swedenborg extensively, that he's familiar with Swedenborg's ideas. We're told that after reading Heaven and Hell, Goethe completed Faust, but he was also fascinated with the science of sight and vision in a mechanical way.
William Blake, the 19th century British visionary, artist, and poet, was another major figure influenced by Swedenborg. Blake encountered Swedenborg's ideas early in his life, and for a number of years wrestled strenuously with them.
Blake was immersed in those ideas as a young person, and then he found it necessary to reject them in order to develop himself as an artist and a visionary. In his later work, we find Swedenborg's ideas re-emerging in a more mature Blake, where they're integrated with Blake's ideas, his concepts of the human imagination as a motivating force in the visionary life.
While Swedenborg's influence is felt around the world, It found an especially deep resonance with the fundamental American beliefs in human rights and religious freedom. His ideas have permeated countless aspects of the culture. The most potent early expression of Swedenborgian ideas was that of writer and philosopher Ralph Waldo Emerson.
In the early 19th century, many people read Swedenborg. In fact, Henry Ward Beecher, a popular preacher of the day, said that nobody was educated who'd not read Swedenborg. So various artists were sensitive to what Swedenborg had to say about the spirit. And they talked about it, they painted about it, they expressed it themselves in their own work. Swedenborg got absorbed into American culture in this way.
Visual artists were especially attracted to Swedenborg's sense of light as evidence of the immanence of the divine in the natural world. Swedenborg's highly visual ideas are brought to life in the paintings of the Hudson River School and include those of founder Thomas Cole, along with Frederick Church and George Inness. Swedenborg's concepts also influenced the canvases of the Brandywine School of Art, which included those of Howard Pyle and the Wyeth lineage, N.C. Andrew and Jamie Wyeth. Meanwhile, Ralph Waldo Emerson corresponded with the English writer Thomas Carlyle, who shared Swedenborg's ideas with John Ruskin, founder of the worldwide arts and crafts movement. The expression of a deep appreciation for nature and natural materials Architect Daniel Burnham used Swedenborg's ideas of heaven in his design for the rebuilding of Chicago.
If you look at descriptions of heaven, you can start to see similarities between the plan of Chicago after the Great Chicago Fire and descriptions of heaven through Emmanuel Swedenborg. And the most recent research shows us through letters and documentation that in fact that's just what he was trying to do, that the plan of Chicago, the way the streets are laid out, the way the quadrants are laid out, everything has some reference or correspondence, if you will, to the writings of Emmanuel Swedenborg.
Swedenborg's spiritual ideas concerning freedom and human values have spread throughout American society. His ideas have helped to shape a number of important social movements, such as utopian communities like Brook Farm in Massachusetts, where people attempted to live according to heavenly principles. Many champions of the anti-slavery movement were people who were also stirred by Swedenborg's ideas on freedom and human dignity. New research at the Lincoln Log Cabin Center reveals that when Abraham Lincoln was a child, he had a close relationship with his Swedenborgian neighbors.
Lincoln was very good friends with a family by the name of Sargent, and family records indicate that he had long and detailed conversations with the Sargents about Swedenborg's teachings.
A number of experts now believe that the Sargents told Lincoln about Swedenborg's ideas concerning human freedom and his deep appreciation for the spiritual nature of African people. Another leader in the anti-slavery cause was Lydia Maria Child, editor of an anti-slavery paper in New York, who said she considered Swedenborg one of her most important inspirations. Swedenborg's works also gave strength and encouragement to the women's rights movement. Early feminist Margaret Fuller wrote that she was particularly impressed with his understanding of a woman's role as an equal partner in marriage. Swedenborg's ideas also lit the way for the interfaith religious movement, particularly his insistence that the divine is present in all religions. In the late 19th century, a Swedenborgian attorney, Charles Bonney, initiated the Parliament of World Religions as part of the Great Chicago World's Fair. Bonney believed that the conference would usher in a new era of religious tolerance and understanding.
It had a tremendous impact, and it marks really the introduction of Eastern religion into this country. It was a turning point in our American spiritual history. Then we're now living in a culture where there are cities with more Muslims than Episcopalians, where there are Buddhist temples, where you can walk down the street and see people in saffron robes. It's a wonderful thing that's happening, and a world in which now we are faced with the need of understanding and seeing the beauty in other religions.
The enduring quality of Swedenborg's influence is no doubt largely due to the rare nature of his spiritual wisdom, at once transcendent and highly practical.
I think Swedenborg's most important legacy is the understanding that the important thing about our religious being is our motivation. What is in our hearts and in our minds, not our beliefs, not our actions, but that which comes from within, from our spirits.
What Swedenborg tells us about eternity and about our lives is that we actually control it within ourselves, and that choice and that free will eventually define us through eternity.
If I were to pick one thing as the most important center core of Swedenborg's message that was intended to change the world and has begun to do it, it's the teaching that this higher power is purely and solely loving and utterly and infinitely wise. There's no angry God, there is no will to damn us. Whenever we turn to the divine, we can turn for affection and understanding and healing.
We are born without factual knowledge, so that we may come into all knowledge, and progress into intelligence, and through this into wisdom. By using become truly human and enter into eternity.
If you'd like to purchase a copy of the award-winning documentary Splendors of the Spirit, Swedenborg's Quest for Insight, call 1-800-355-3222 or visit the website at swedenborg.com. Did you know that a genius from 18th century Sweden had a profound influence on American culture and modern social movements? His name was Emmanuel Swedenborg, an eminent scientist and visionary. Learn about his many scientific inventions and see a model of his airplane in the Smithsonian Institute. Discover his well-documented spiritual experiences, his writings on the mysteries of the afterlife, the language of angels, and the meaning of life. Join us for the award-winning documentary Splendors of the Spirit, Swedenborg's Quest for Insight.